Welcome to Faculty Voices. Gareth Doherty is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He is also an affiliate at the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. His most recent book is Landscape Fieldwork: How Engaging the World Can Change Design. Welcome to Faculty Voices.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you for having me.
I was really surprised, Gareth, to see that this new book contains an entire chapter on the urban ecology of Brazilian sacred groves. One doesn't usually associate that subject with landscape architecture. So, could you tell us a bit about this relationship and how you got interested in the topic?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question. In my work, I use fieldwork, or more precisely, landscape fieldwork, to better understand landscapes. So I like to engage in a very deep way with the landscapes that I'm studying. But I'm acutely aware that in our teaching, we often focus on Western Europe and in North America. And in my work over the last 10, 15 years, I've been focused on societies in which there isn't a formal profession of landscape architecture.
Ah, uh-huh.
And often we don't have the official histories or literature to work with, and therefore we need to do field work in order to understand these landscapes and to bring them into our teaching. So I've been doing that in landscapes in different parts of the world, in the Middle East, in the Caribbean, in Afro-Brazil. My connection with Brazil started in 1996 when I went to work in the office of Roberto Burle Marx. Burle Marx was probably the leading landscape architect of the 20th century. He died in 1994, 2 years before I went to Brazil. But in the 3 months I spent in his office, I visited many of his landscapes, public and private, and became fascinated not just with the work of Roberto Burle Marx, but with Brazil.
Fascinating. You talk about trance in this chapter
That's right.
and how that embodied experience should be of interest to landscape architects. But can you explain to us that connection? Why?
Sure, of course. So I need to give you a little bit of background first to explain that. But these Afro-Brazilian spaces are a legacy of the slave trade. And Salvador de Bahia was a center of the slave trade. It was the original capital of Brazil. It's, some people say it's the most African city outside of Africa. And it's punctuated by sacred groves. It was illegal until about 50 years ago to practice any African descendant spirituality in Brazil. And these spaces often are considered almost secret, almost like secret parks in the middle of the city. And I'm fascinated by these spaces because they're heavily designed spaces, but they're not designed with a logic that we normally teach in a design school. It's a logic based on the cultivation of different energies of nature. So within these sacred groves, there is a profound respect for the various energies of materials and of leaves. Within the spaces, they cultivate the energy of the rainbow, the energy of the air, the energy of water, the energy of love, the energy of chance. And the elements that they work with are usually leaves and materials. And what do landscape architects work with? We work with leaves and we work with materials and we work with people. And these elements in these spaces converge and culminate for many people in trance, where the person becomes embodied with energies or of nature.
Have you experienced this trance yourself?
Yes, I unexpectedly was entranced, and this is part of the chapter. I felt it was important to explain that process because it also explains more about my relationship to the space, but I think it's also a fundamental part of the experience of these spaces.
You talk about how landscape architects often work through intuition. And I'm wondering what's the difference between the process of intuition and the process of being in a trance? How does that help you understand in a different way or the same way as intuition does?
I think that's a very interesting question. I find that when I tell many of my colleagues about this experience of trance, it's seen as something different. It's something to be afraid of. It's something that is foreign to us and not intuitive. I remember the day that it first happened to me in the Grove. I didn't know what had happened. I knew something had happened, but I didn't know what had happened. And nobody explained to me because it's something that is just quite normal there. And I think it's really quite wonderful when you enter into these spaces. And this is not just a feature in Brazilian cities, but this is common in West Africa also, that you enter a sacred grove. And when you do, you're almost acknowledging that you have to be open to the idea that the energy of a tree may put you into a trance.
That's so interesting. Could you describe for our listeners a little bit of what that was like?
It's difficult to explain, but in the book, I describe what happened. And I had been visiting the terreiro, because they're called terreiros or yards, for a couple of years, and I found them, interesting spaces. I thought of it as almost pre-field work. I knew there was something there. It was an intuition that was driving me, not an intellectual project. It was more a responding on intuition. And every year in the Sacred Grove, in which I spend most of my time, there's an annual festival, and I attended the festival. And in fact, I worked hard for that festival for a couple of weeks, going to the Terreiro and helping with sweeping the floor and putting up decorations and so on. But it's a great way also of talking with people and getting to know the space. And one day there was a festival and I was very tired and I just wanted to leave. And the mother of the house was entranced, became entranced. And I realized something had happened because when the person is entranced, they have gone away and their place is the Orisha, the energy of nature. And she was entranced with the energy of Ushasi, the Orisha of the forest and the arts and beautiful things. And so Ushasi was giving hugs to everyone in the space. And hugs are very important in Afro-Brazilian space. It's transferring of energy, of ashe. Ashe is the energy from which all life flows. It's the fundamental aspect of Afro-Brazilian spirituality. And Oshasi hugged everyone around me, but did not hug me. I felt left out. I felt maybe slightly offended. And before I was leaving that day, I knew I wanted to get a hug from Oshasi. And then a queue or a line formed of people who also wanted to get hugs. So clearly Oshasi had missed other people as well. And I joined that line. And as soon as I joined the line, Oshasi came straight to me, dancing with his eyes closed. And also, I think a very interesting thing in Afro-Brazilian religions is the gender fluidity, because the Orishas often have a different gender to the person who is. So Oshasi comes straight to me and hugs me. But I knew it was a very special hug because it seemed to take a very long time.
Uh-huh.
And Oshasi's head was covered with a turban, and that turban was splashed with blood from the sacrifice of goats and chickens that had taken place as part of the ceremony. And Oshasi touched his head on my head one, two, three times. And on the third time, I couldn't move. I was totally frozen. Totalmente congelado was how I described it in Portuguese. It just means totally frozen, but my body felt warm. And the next thing, I was lying on the floor and I was opening my eyes and looking, and there were people looking at me, staring at me, and one of them being the one of the leaders of the house who said energia boa, good energy. And but I didn't quite know what had happened.
So after you had this experience, how did your form of investigation of seeing these spaces change? Or did it?
Yes, it changed very much because people told me this is a sign that you're supposed to spend time here.
Uh-huh.
The Orishas like you. And it made me feel more at home in the space. And I also came to appreciate that there are forms of knowledge that we can best experience in the field. I had been fascinated by trance. I had been reading books about trance and how people had written about trance, and particularly in Afro-Brazilian religions. But I could have spent 5 years reading about trance, and that doesn't match the actual experience of getting entranced.
Uh-huh.
And I think that really helped a lot to move beyond that and to begin to understand the space materially and spatially and ritually, because it's a combination of materials, leaves, and the aesthetics of the rituals, which are very powerful music with drums and the beating of the drums, and all of that precipitates trance.
So you say you were reading lots of books and doing research on trance, but what do you think, what are you adding to the conversation?
Yeah, so I was reading about trance. I never expected it would happen to me. What I'm trying to add to the conversation is that most of the literature that I've been on Afro-Brazilian spaces deals with the phenomenon of trance rather than the space themselves. And so I see the trance as a manifestation of spatial and material conditions. And then what do landscape architects work with? We work with space and we work with materials.
Uh-huh.
And that's why I believe we have to be open to these types of possibilities.
I was surprised by the fact that you don't carry a notebook, phone, or camera when you're doing
Yeah.
research. How do you remember things?
That makes fieldwork really difficult because I'm a field worker, and normally when I do field work, I will have a notebook with me. I sketch, I draw, I keep notes, I take photographs, I take videos and films. And in this space, I'm not allowed to have a notebook. I'm not allowed to have a phone. I'm not allowed to wear shoes. And I have to work. So there's no time to take notes even when I'm there. But I memorize. And when I'm there, I write in my mind. And then when I get a chance, I will transcribe it. So there were parts of that chapter that were written. There's one part of it where I was in the Tehero for 3 days and nights, and I was locked up in a room to cultivate my personal energies. And during that time, I was writing about the description of the space and so on. And then this ends up as in the chapter, but I wrote it down much later.
That's interesting. So you couldn't make any visual images of what was going on, of these secret spaces.
No, because these spaces are, there is a long tradition of secrecy for good reasons. And then there's also the respect for the Orishas, even when photography is allowed in the spaces, there are certain aspects of the Tehero that you cannot photograph. And you definitely cannot photograph or video the Orishas when they arrive.
What can you photograph?
Oh, you can photograph the, let's say, the more public aspects of the secret space.
For those who haven't read this book yet, and I highly recommend reading it, what are the public aspects? Is there tourism going on here? What's happening?
Yes, there's a lot of tourism. In fact, these Afro-Brazilian tejeros are firmly, I think I say this in the book, firmly on the to-do list of tourists visiting Salvador. And I was in Salvador for 2 months this past summer, and there was one tejero that I visited for a ritual. And there were a lot of tourists there, and one tourist had actually taken a video of the orishas, and then there was a whole fuss because he ran away with his camera, and then people had to run after him, and then negotiate the deletion of the images.
Mm.
Yes, they're incredible events and very beautiful. Some, as I said, some people are afraid of difference. But I think one of the big problems in the world today is a fear of difference. And the more we can expose people to forms of difference and to different ways of inhabiting space, then I think the better the world will be.
You started going to these secret spaces many years ago. And I'm assuming, maybe it's not a correct assumption, that when you started to research, you weren't really a fluent Portuguese speaker.
That's right.
How did the process of learning the language influence your understanding and your participation in these sacred spaces?
I must admit that I'm still not totally fluent in Portuguese, but I can communicate. And I think one of the other challenges in these spaces is that you don't ask questions. You can ask questions, but they're not going to answer you, probably. You learn through a process that the Brazilian anthropologist Marcio Goldman describes as gathering leaves. And in fact, that's the title of the chapter is Gathering Leaves. And this process of gathering leaves refers to the elders who give you a leaf of information. And there's a process, through a process of quiet working in the Tehero, you gather leaves, and eventually the elders decide when you have enough leaves to move up in the hierarchy of the house. Oddly, for doing field work, these spaces, everything is wrong. You cannot take notes, you cannot use a phone, and you cannot ask questions. But you learn through a process of observation, of quiet observation. And in a way, that is there, everyone is a field worker because they have an embodied engagement with this landscape. And there are no texts or very few, there are a few texts, okay, but generally people do not learn about Afro-Brazilian religions or spirituality through text. It's through a process of gathering leaves.
So interesting. Some of our listeners are people who have never heard of these religions, have never heard of these spaces, but some of our listeners, I'm sure, are people who are landscape architects or anthropologists or think about these issues. So I'm blatantly going to plagiarize a couple of more theoretical questions. The first one, and this will sound very familiar to you, is how can landscape architecture theory, education, and practice benefit from working with societies with no formal landscape architecture discipline?
Landscape architecture is a relatively new profession, just over 100 years old. And most countries in the world today do not have a formal profession of landscape architecture. But most countries in the world, all countries in the world, have landscape practices. The landscapes are shaped all over the world, just mostly not by landscape architects. And our education has been disproportionately focused on Western Europe and North America. So my recent project and the Afro-Brazilian sacred groves led me to the source in West Africa, where I've been studying sacred groves in Nigeria and spending time there. And that led me to a wider study on the practice of landscape architecture all over the African continent. And one of the things that shocked me from a year of fieldwork on how landscape architecture is taught and practiced in Africa. I visited almost every all university programs apart from one, I think, in on the African continent. And they mostly teach about Europe and North America. They do not teach about Africa in Africa. And the same in the rest of the world. And I believe it's through doing field work like this in landscapes that don't exist in our curricula that we can diversify the field. And in fact, this work on Afro Brazil is now in the core curriculum at the Graduate School of Design. So our students learn about Afro-Brazilian sacred groves. And they learn about landscapes in the Caribbean, in West Africa, North Africa, and so on, all because of doing field work. And I think that is an important practice for landscape architects.
So the second sort of theoretical question you have answered in part, but I'm going to ask you. How does comparing landscapes of diverse societies better inform landscape architects' sensitivity to the values that shape others' attitudes towards the landscapes they dwell in and make?
That's a great question. And a lot of landscape architecture is linked to processes of colonialism. And we see that very clearly in Africa, where many of the great landscapes are a result of the colonizer in a way. And I believe that very firmly that in order to provide another narrative, that we need to be able to understand those landscape practices that happen outside of the formal discipline so that we're not just reproducing the same model all over the world of because landscapes are situated in societies in landscapes but in climates that vary, and we need to be aware of these differences. So I do not see landscape architecture as a universal practice. I see it as something that is very much rooted not just in the land, but in the societies that inhabit the land.
I understand that an earlier book of yours has just been translated into Portuguese. Do you want
That's
to
right.
tell us about that?
That's right. Yes, Paradoxes of Green, Landscapes of a City State was my first major fieldwork where I spent a year living in Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. And I did that out of this frustration I have about how we normally teach landscape architecture theory based on Western Europe and North America. And I wanted to understand landscape concepts in a society that didn't have landscape architects. And Bahrain is a tiny island in just off the coast of Saudi Arabia. It's linked to Saudi Arabia by a causeway, but it's 10 miles wide and 30 miles long or so, the main island in Bahrain. And I chose it because it's a very extreme landscape. It's extremely small. It's an
Uh-huh.
entire nation state in this island, so it's a city state. So it's extremely small, extremely arid, extremely hot, and extremely beige. So the landscape, indigenous landscape, is a beige desert. And yet, in this beige desert, there's an obsession with the creation of green space. And you asked me about my Portuguese. For going to Bahrain, I took a year of intensive Arabic classes. I would get up every day, go to Arabic class. And I discovered when I went to Bahrain that there is no word for landscape in Arabic. There's not a good translation. It's the same in Portuguese, similar in Portuguese. And when I tried to talk to people about landscape, they almost always brought up al khudra or the greenery. And so for many Bahrainis, associated landscape with green. And I came to conclude that the landscape is the biggest change that you can make of the indigenous beige desert landscape. And as far as I can tell from my fieldwork, over half the water of the state is used to irrigate green space. But this is an island or city state that doesn't have any water, so the water is all desalinated. And then most of it is just poured into the ground to create green for reasons that are mostly aesthetic. But that greenery creates values which are social, economic, political, and at the same time, there's an environmental cost. And there's a paradox here because well, there's several paradoxes, but I think the main one is that many people equate green with environmentalism, but this is a concept from Western Europe. And in a beige landscape like Bahrain, this doesn't work. So the creation of green space isn't very green from an environmental point of view.
So the book is in Portuguese, but so reach more people. But what do you think is the significance of its being in Portuguese?
The significance, I was just in, I've been working in Brazil, and my current project in Brazil asks how can we make Brazilian cities greener? Now, Brasilia is a very interesting, and I was in Brasilia last month for a book launch, also in Rio and São Paulo, Curitiba and Salvador. And Brasilia is particularly interesting because for 8 months of the year, their climate is not that different to Bahrain, but they're different because they have a rainy season. And I have been fascinated by this comparison. And part of my argument about Bahrain, and this extends to other cities, is that we can be more deliberate and more sensitive, maybe more efficient in our use of green space by a more thoughtful and considerate use of color in our built environment more generally. So can we, instead of having a large expanse of green, can we have a smaller amount of green and maybe we can complement that with a red wall, for
Hmm.
example. And so we've been doing, I run a lab at the GSD called the Critical Landscapes Design Lab. And we have been working with color theory to find ways to amplify the impact of green by introducing other colors as well. And so this project in Brazil, how to make Brazilian cities greener, is looking at 6 cities in 6 different landscape domains. So they have different climate, different vegetation, and but asking how we can be more green by introducing other colors as well.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. Is there anything you would like to add?
No, I just want to say thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You've been listening on Faculty Voices to Gareth Doherty. He's Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. He's also an affiliate at the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard. His most recent book, which we've talked about a lot here, is Landscape Fieldwork: How Engaging the World Can Change Design. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.